Welcome back to Women of Insurance. If you've been following this special series, thank you for continuing your journey with me. In episode 16, we introduced the philosophy behind Become the Value. It isn't about chasing more opportunities or waiting for someone to recognize your potential. It was about becoming the kind of person who naturally creates opportunities because of who you are. In episode 17, we took that idea a step further by asking a simple but challenging question. Who am I becoming? I believe that's one of the most important questions we can ask ourselves because opportunities don't create valuable people. Valuable people create opportunities. Today, I want to take that conversation even deeper. Once you've decided that becoming the value is the goal, another question naturally follows. What is that value actually made of? Is it talent, intelligence, education, charisma, ambition, work ethic? I mean, those qualities, certainly matter, and I would never diminish them. Talent is a gift. Education expands our thinking. Hard work creates momentum. Ambition can move us towards meaningful goals. But after years of watching leaders, entrepreneurs, business owners, and professionals, I've become convinced that none of these things are the foundation of life that lasts. The foundation is really character. And I don't think we talked about that nearly enough. Now, one question has stayed with me for years, and it's one I want you to think about as we begin today's conversation. Why do two people with similar talents, similar education, and similar opportunities end up in completely different places, let's say 20 years from now? Maybe you've seen it yourself. Two people graduate from the same university. They start at the same company. They receive similar training, have the same abilities, and even share the same ambitions. Yet, decades later, one has become someone others deeply trust. People seek their wisdom. They want to work with them, follow them, and build alongside them. And the other may have an impressive resume. They may have made a lot of money or accumulated titles and accomplishments, yet somehow along the way, the relationships deteriorated, trust disappeared, and people admired what they achieved without necessarily wanting to become like them. So, what happened? Most people would point to different opportunities or different circumstances, but I truly can't. I believe the difference is rarely action. More often than not, it's character. Talent can create success. Character determines whether success can be sustained. And that reminds me of something author David Brooks wrote in his book, The Road to Character. He said, we live in a culture that encourages us to think about externally, how to build external success, but leaves many of us inarticulate about how to cultivate the inner life. The time that I read that, I had to stop and think about it. Our culture has become incredibly good at teaching us how to build the external life. We learn how to market ourselves, negotiate, build businesses, increase productivity, create influence, and grow our income. Those are valuable skills, and they've certainly played an important role in my own journey. But I think very few people teach us how to build the person behind the accomplishments. How do we become more trustworthy? How do we develop humility when success begins to arrive? How do we remain teachable after we've gained experience? And how do we lead with integrity when compromise would be easier. Now, those are questions about character. And David Brooks introduces two ideas that I think every leader should wrestle with. He calls them résumé virtues and eulogy virtues. Résumé virtues are the qualities that help us succeed in the marketplace. Our education, our skills, our achievements, our promotions, our certifications, and our accomplishments all belong in that category. But eulogy virtues are very different. They're the qualities people remember after your life is over. No one stands at a memorial service talking about how many followers you had on Instagram or social media or how many awards you won. They talk about whether you kept your word, whether you were generous, whether you made people feel seen, whether you were honest, faithful, compassionate, and dependable. That distinction has challenged me because if I'm not honest, it's easy to spend years building a resume while unintentionally neglecting the person writing it. And that's exactly why this conversation matters. The philosophy of become the value has never been about becoming more impressive. It's about becoming more trustworthy. It's about recognizing that every opportunity, every relationship, every leadership position, and every legacy will eventually rest on one invisible foundation, the person you've become. So before we spend our lives asking, how do I become more successful? Perhaps we should ask a better question. Am I becoming the kind of person that success can trust? Now, as we continue this conversation, I want to challenge one of the greatest myths about success. It's a myth that most of us have believed at one point or another because it's reinforced almost everywhere we look. We celebrate the gifted, the accomplished, the brilliant, and the high achievers. We assume that if someone is talented enough, intelligent enough, or ambitious enough, success is inevitable. Talent certainly matters. It creates opportunity. It solves problems. It opens doors that may have otherwise remained closed. There is nothing wrong with pursuing excellence or developing your gifts. In fact, I believe we're called to steward those gifts well. But here's what life has taught me. Talent can take you somewhere that character is not prepared to keep you. Like if you've been in business long enough, you've probably seen this firsthand. Maybe you've watched someone who seemed to have every advantage imaginable. They were charismatic, intelligent, hardworking, and incredibly gifted. They knew how to inspire people, build momentum, and create excitement. On paper, they look like the person most likely to succeed. Yet years later, you discover that the business is gone, the partnerships have fallen apart, or the trust they once enjoyed has quietly disappeared. When that happens, our first instinct is often to ask, what happened? Rarely is the answer that they lost their talent. More often than not, they lost the trust of the people around them. They like that distinction is important because talent and character are not competing qualities. They're complementary. Talent may determine what you're capable of accomplishing, but character determines how you accomplish it and whether the people around you continue believing in you once you've achieved it. David Brooks captures this tension beautifully in The Road to Character. He writes, the resume virtues are the ones you bring to the marketplace. The eulogy virtues are the ones people talk about after you're gone. And the first time I read that, I found myself reflecting on how much of our lives are devoted to building resume virtues. From the time we're young, we're encouraged to improve our grades, develop our skills, earn degrees, build our careers, pursue promotions, increase your income, and collect accomplishments. Like those things aren't wrong. They create opportunities to serve others, provide for our families, and make meaningful contributions to the world. But Brooke points out something that our culture often overlooks. And once again, very few people teach us how to intentionally cultivate the qualities that ultimately define a life: integrity, humility, courage, compassion, faithfulness, generosity, dependability. And those qualities don't usually appear at the top of a resume, but they're the very things people remember when your career is over. Think about the difference between attending an award banquet and attending a memorial service. At an award banquet, when people celebrate accomplishments, they recognize promotions, milestones, production numbers, innovations, years of service, and the measurable success that represent a lifetime of hard work. Those celebrations are meaningful because they acknowledge the discipline, sacrifice, and commitment it took to building something valuable. A memorial service, however, is a very different kind of gathering. The conversation rarely centers on how many awards someone receives, how much money they accumulated, or how many followers they had on social media. Those accomplishments may be mentioned, but they are almost never what moves people to tears. Instead, people remember the kind of person they were. They remembered whether their word could be trusted, whether they treated others with dignity, whether success made them more humble instead of more prideful, and whether they were generous with their time, patient with their family, faithful to their commitments, and willing to help others without expecting anything in return. David Brooks calls these eulogy virtues, and I believe they reveal one of the greatest truths about a meaningful life. At the end of our lives, people won't primarily remember us for what we accomplished. They'll remember us for who we became, and how our character shaped the lives of everyone fortunate enough to know us. I think that's a powerful reminder because it forces us to ask a question we don't ask often enough. Am I spending more time building my resume or becoming the kind of person people will one day be grateful they knew? That question, more than any award or achievement, is what ultimately determines our legacy. As I reflected on David Brooks's distinction between resume virtues and eulogy virtues, I found myself asking another question that wasn't particularly comfortable. It was, which virtues am I intentionally developing? If I'm honest, it's much easier to invest in my professional growth than it is to invest in my personal growth. I'll gladly read books on leadership, study financial strategies, attend conferences, learn new systems, and work on becoming a better communicator. Those are all worth investments, and I believe excellence honors the opportunities we've been given. But character requires a different kind of investment. Becoming more patient doesn't happen by accident. Learning humility doesn't happen simply because we've gained experiences. Developing integrity when compromise seems easier, choosing generosity when resources feel limited, extending grace when we've been hurt, or remaining faithful when no one is watching. Though those qualities all require intentionality. They demand daily decisions that often go unnoticed by the world, but quietly shapes the person we're becoming. And that's why I don't believe character is something we simply possess. It's something we cultivate. It isn't formed in a single defining moment, but through, so many countless ordinary choices made over a lifetime. Most of those choices will never receive recognition or applause, yet they become the very experience through which others come to know, trust, and remember us. In the end, like, what character isn't, not what, but character isn't built by the moments everyone sees. It is built by the faithful decisions no one sees until they begin experiencing the person those decisions have created. In the book, The Character Edge by General Robert Caslen, he argues that competence may earn someone a leadership position, but character determines whether they deserve to remain there. I think that's one of the clearest directions between management and leadership. People may initially follow someone's vision, expertise, confidence, but over time, they follow something much deeper. They follow consistency, they follow integrity, they follow someone whose actions continually reinforce their words. I've seen leaders who were exceptional strategists, but poor listeners. I've seen entrepreneurs with brilliant ideas who struggled to maintain healthy partnerships because they valued being right more than being accountable. I've seen organizations filled with talented people slowly lose momentum because trust quietly eroded over time. The problem wasn't intelligence, it wasn't experience, it wasn't ability. The problem was that competence had, let's say, outpaced character. And eventually, character always catches up. There's another book that I've read and listened to. It's called The Speed of Trust by Stephen M.R. Covey. And I quote he his writing that trust is the only thing that changes everything. The more I think about this statement, the more convinced I become that trust is the invisible currency behind every meaningful relationship. Businesses don't thrive simply because they're filled with talented people. They thrive because people trust one another. Marriages don't endure because two people are exceptionally gifted. They endure because trust has been built through years of consistency. Teams don't become great because everyone agrees. They become great because people know they can depend on one another even when they disagree. Trust changes how people communicate. It changes how quickly decisions are made. It changes how conflict is handled. It changes how people respond when mistakes happen. When trust is high, people extend grace. They assume positive intent. They work together to solve problems instead of protecting themselves. But when trust is low, everything becomes heavier. Communication slows down, people become defensive, assumptions replace conversations. Energy that could be spent serving others is redirected towards protecting ourselves. That's why I don't believe trust is built through talent. I believe trust is built through character. One realization has changed the way I evaluate both myself and the people I choose to build with. Talent is a gift, character is a decision. We don't all receive the same natural abilities. Some people are extraordinary communicators, and I've had to work on my communication. and others have analytical minds. Some are just gifted leaders, while others excel in creativity or innovation. Talent is different for every person, but character isn't. Every one of us decides whether we'll keep our word, whether we'll tell the truth when it's inconvenient, whether we'll take responsibility instead of making excuses, whether we'll remain teachable after success begins to arrive. Those decisions seem small in the moment, but repeated over time, they become habits, and those habits shape our character, and our character eventually becomes our reputation. That's why I've become less impressed by talent alone. I've become less impressed of the fancy cars, the Porsches, you name it. I'm less impressed about the mansions and how many followers they have because honestly, applause is temporary. I'm far more interested in the person who quietly does the right things when no one is watching, the person who remains humble after achieving success, the person whose word continues to mean something years after the applause faded. Trust is enduring. And if there's one lesson I hope you take from this part of the conversation, it's this: talent may earn applause, but character earns trust. And trust is what allows your influence, your leadership, and ultimately your legacy to endure. If talent opens a door and character earns trust, then there's another question we have to ask. How do we know what our character is actually made of? And I think it's a fair question because it's easy to believe we're patient until we're inconvenienced. It's easy to believe we're humble until someone disagrees with us. It's easy to believe we're generous when life is abundant, or courageous when nothing meaningful is at stake. Most of us don't truly discover the depth of our character during seasons of comfort. We discover it during seasons of pressure. And for years, people have said that pressure builds character. Like, I understand why we say it, but the longer I live, my 37 long years, the less I believe that's entirely true. I don't think pressure creates character. I think pressure reveals it. Imagine a builder constructing two houses side by side. From the street, they appear identical. The craftsmanship is beautiful. The landscaping is complete. And to everyone passing by, there's no obvious difference between the two. Then a storm arrives. Heavy rain falls, the wind pushes against both structures, and the foundation of each home is tested. Now, when the storm passes, one house remains standing while the other begins to fall. The storm didn't decide which house had the stronger foundation, it just simply revealed it. Life works the same way. Pressure doesn't create integrity, it reveals whether integrity was already present. Pressure doesn't suddenly make us prideful or humble. It simply removes the comfort that once allowed those qualities to remain hidden. In in so many ways, pressure is one of life's most honest teachers because it introduces us to ourselves. Henry Cloud, in his book Integrity, offers a definition that challenged the way I thought about character. He writes, integrity is the courage to meet the demands of reality. I appreciate that definition because integrity is often reduced to honesty. We think integrity means simply telling the truth or avoiding deception. While those things certainly matter, Henry Cloud argues that integrity is much larger than honesty. Integrity is wholeness. It becomes the same person. It's becoming the same person regardless of the environment you're in. It's having the courage to face difficult conversations instead of avoiding them. It's accepting reality instead of creating excuses. It's taking responsibility for your choices rather than searching for someone else to blame. That definition resonates with me because reality has a way of exposing what appearances often hide. Success can hide insecurity. Title can hide immaturity. Confidence can hide pride. But pressure has very little interest in appearances. Pressure is interested in revealing foundations. And over the years, I've had the opportunity to watch, leaders navigate seasons of change. Some of those seasons have been exciting, while others have been incredibly difficult. Change has a way of testing everyone involved because uncertainty often magnifies whatever already exists beneath the surface. I remember observing two leaders who found themselves in very similar circumstances. Both were respected, both had influence, both had opportunities to continue building something meaningful. Yet when the organization entered a season of transition, of growth, of pressure, they responded in two completely different ways. One leader chose the difficult path. They communicated openly, with people they had built alongside them. They accepted responsibility where responsibility belonged. They honored relationships even when conversations became uncomfortable. They understood that leadership isn't only measured by how you build something, but also by how you leave it. The second leader chose a different approach. Rather than engaging in difficult conversation, communication gradually disappeared. Instead of examining personal responsibility, attention shifted towards, blaming systems or blaming that there weren't systems, leadership, blaming compensation or the environment in itself. The belief seemed to be that a different organization would automatically produce different results. At first, both decisions may have appeared reasonable depending on who was telling the story, but time has a way of revealing what emotions often conceal. The leader who chose accountability continued building trust because trust had always been the foundation of their leadership. The others struggled to produce the results they believed they would naturally follow once they found a better environment. Even the businesses they built, during that time before they transitioned was truly falling apart because of the lack of integrity, which showed up in their production. I don't share that story to criticize anyone. I share it because it taught me something that I'll never forget. And even though I say home is wherever you're at, and that is true, but changing environments rarely fixes a character problem. If we consistently avoid accountability in one place, we'll likely avoid it in the next. If we blame systems before examining ourselves, we'll eventually carry that mindset into every opportunity we're given. Wherever we go, we take ourselves with us. That's a difficult truth because our natural tendency is to believe that the next opportunity will solve the frustration we're experiencing today. Sayings like, ah, if I had a different boss, if I worked for another company, if I had better leadership, if people appreciated me more. Sometimes those things aren't legitimate. They are unhealthy environments. There are unhealthy organizations, unhealthy relationships. Wisdom sometimes requires us to leave. But even when leaving is the right decision, there's still a question every one of us should ask before we walk away. What is this season trying to teach me? Because if we never learn the lesson, we'll often recreate the same pattern somewhere else. Pressure doesn't simply expose problems around us, it exposes patterns within us. And that's a gift if we're humble enough to receive it. One of the greatest differences I've noticed between leaders who continue growing and those who eventually plateau has very little to do with intelligence, talent, and experience. More often than not, it comes down to teachability. Pressure has a way of placing every leader at a crossroads where they must decide what they're going to protect. Some chose to protect their pride, while others chose to protect their principles. Pride has a familiar voice. It tells us they just don't understand me. It convinces us that systems failed us, that other people are the problem, or that our circumstances are to blame. Principles, how, however, they ask a different question. They ask, what can I learn from this? Where can I take greater responsibility? And how can I grow from through this experience? Through, not from, through this experience. Pride is consumed with protecting our image, but principles are committed to pursuing growth. One posture leads to stagnation because it resists correction. The other leads to maturity because it remains open to learning. As I reflect on my own journey, I've become convinced that many of the greatest seasons of growth didn't come from my biggest successes. They came from the season of pressure, a moment that forced me to confront parts of myself that comfort had quietly allowed me to ignore. And looking back, I realized those seasons weren't interruptions to my growth, they were the very process of growth. Pressure didn't change who I was, it revealed who I still needed to become. And perhaps that's why I've come to see pressure differently. I no longer view it as simply as an obstacle to overcome, but as one of God's greatest gifts. Not because it's enjoyable or comfortable, but because it's honest. It strips away the distractions, exposes the foundation beneath our lives, and reminds us that opportunities rarely reveal our character the way adversity does. Success may celebrate our gifts, but pressure reveals our foundation. And when that foundation has been built on integrity, humility, truth, and every storm becomes less about surviving and more about proving that what we've been building all along the way was built to last. There's a quote by Stephen M.R. Covey, on his book, The Speed of Trust. And he says, trust is the one thing that changes everything. As we've worked our way through this episode, we've established that talent can create opportunities, character builds trust, and pressure reveals the foundation beneath our lives. But there is one obstacle that quietly threatens all three, and it's often the one we recognize last. Can you guys take a guess? It's ego. The interesting thing about ego is that it rarely announces itself, or that our experience exempts us from correction. Ego doesn't always make us think we're better than other people. Sometimes it simply convinces us that we no longer need them, like that's what makes it so dangerous. Ryan Holiday writes in Ego is the Enemy. Ego is the enemy of what you want and what you have. The first time I read that statement, I realized he wasn't just talking about ambition. He was describing a pattern that had repeated itself through history. Time and time again, we've watched gifted athletes, brilliant entrepreneurs, influential leaders, and talented professionals rise to incredible heights only to lose what they had because they stopped growing long before they stopped succeeding. It wasn't a lack of ability that became their downfall. It was the belief that ability was enough, that a stage was enough, that influence was enough. One of the greatest misconceptions about success is that achievement automatically produces wisdom. It doesn't. Success often gives us more confidence, but confidence and wisdom are not the same thing. In fact, success can become one of the greatest tests of our character because it changes the way people interact with us. The more successful we become, the more likely people are to compliment us instead of challenge us. They celebrate our victories, affirm our decisions, and sometimes hesitate to tell us the truth because they assume we already have the answers. Now, if we're not careful, we begin believing the silence, that the silence means agreement, and that agreement means we're beyond correction. That's where ego quietly begins to grow. It convinces us that because we've produced results, we no longer need accountability. It tells us that our track record is enough evidence that our perspective is always right. Over time, we stop asking questions, we stop listening as carefully, and we begin defending our opinions instead of examining them. The tragedy isn't that we've become successful. The tragedy is that we've stopped becoming teachable. As I think about the leaders I've respected most throughout my life, one quality consistently stands out above all others. They never acted like they had arrived. No matter how much they accomplished, they continued asking questions. They welcomed feedback. They admitted when they were wrong. They surrounded themselves with people who were willing to challenge them instead of simply agreeing with them. Their confidence didn't come from believing they knew everything. It came from knowing they were always capable of learning something new. I've I've also, seen the opposite. I've watched talented leaders slowly become isolated because they stopped inviting honest conversations. They began surrounding themselves with people who affirmed them rather than people who sharpened them. I've seen a lot of leaders who have followers that are just affirming them. Every disagreement became a personal attack instead of an opportunity to grow. Every piece of feedback felt like criticism instead of a gift. The difficult part is that this usually doesn't happen overnight. Ego grows quietly. One ignored piece of feedback, one excuse, one refusal to apologize, one decision to protect an image instead of pursuing truth. Eventually, those small choices accumulate until correction feels threatening rather than helpful. I think that's why humility is one of the most misunderstood qualities in leadership. Humility doesn't mean thinking less of yourself, nor does it mean lacking confidence in your abilities. Humility simply means recognizing that no matter how much you've learned, there's always more to learn. Without humility, success has a tendency to inflate our ego. With humility, success becomes another opportunity to grow, serve, and develop the people around us. One sentence has continued to challenge me throughout my leadership journey, and I believe it captures this entire idea. The moment we believe we're too important to be corrected, we've become too dangerous to lead. Think about that for a moment. Leadership isn't dangerous because someone lacks talent. Leadership becomes dangerous when someone believes they're beyond accountability. The people who cause the greatest damage are rarely those who don't know enough. They're often the ones who believe they already know everything. Every leader has blind spots. Every entrepreneur has blind spots. Every parent has blind spots. Every spouse has blind spots. The question isn't whether blind spots exist. The question is whether we've invited people into our lives who loves us enough to point them out. Correction isn't enemy of leadership. It's one of the greatest gifts a leader can receive because correction protects us from becoming someone our success can no longer sustain. As I reflect on my own journey, I've learned a lot of great lessons, and it didn't come from books I've read or conferences or living vicariously through other people. These were firsthand experiences that I can say have rocked me to my core, rocked me back to who I strive to become. A lot of them came from moments when someone cared enough to challenge me. At the time, those conversations weren't always comfortable. In fact, some of them exposed attitudes, assumptions, or habits I didn't even realize I had. Or maybe I did, but never put a stop to shifting those habits. Now, looking back, I'm truly grateful for every one of those moments and for the people who were a part of those moments, not because they were easy, but because they prevented me from confusing competence with maturity. There's a significant difference between becoming more skilled and becoming more wise. Skills help us perform. Wisdom helps us lead. Character requires both. Now, one of the commitments I've tried to make throughout my own life is to remain a student, regardless of what titles I hold or how much experience I gain or have. The day I believe I've arrived is the day I stop growing. It's the day I pretty much considered or would consider the day I die. The day I stop growing is the day my leadership begins to decline, even if my accomplishment continues to increase. I don't want to become someone who is admired for past achievements, but resistant to present growth. I want to remain a curious person. I want to remain accountable. I want to remain teachable because I believe teachability is one of the purest expressions of humility, and humility is one of the strongest protectors of character. As we prepare to close this episode, I'd encourage you to ask yourself one honest question. Who has permission to correct me? Not compliment me, not encourage me, correct me. Who in your life loves you enough to tell you the truth, even when it's uncomfortable? And when they do, is your first response to defend yourself or is it to listen? Those questions may be uncomfortable, but they reveal something important. Ego resists correction because it wants to preserve an image. Character welcomes correction because it wants to become better. And if become the value has taught us anything throughout this series, it's that our greatest goal isn't to appear valuable. It's to become the kind of person who continues growing, continues learning, and continues choosing character long after the applause has faded. Now, as we bring this conversation to a close, I'd like to leave you with one final perspective. Throughout this episode, I've talked about talent, trust, pressure, integrity, and character. Each one matters, but they all point towards, a much bigger question. When your life is over, what will actually remain? Our culture spends a great deal of time teaching us how to build successful careers, grow businesses, and achieve measurable results. We celebrate promotions, awards, influence, and accomplishments because those are things we can easily see. They're tangible, they're measurable. They're often worthy of celebrating because they represent years of discipline and sacrifice. But accomplishments were never meant to become the ultimate measure of a person's life. They're only part of the story. The deeper question is what those accomplishments produce within you and around you. Did success make you more humble or more entitled? Did influence make you more generous or more self-centered? Did leadership teach you to serve people, or did it slowly convince you that people existed to serve you? Those are the questions that determine legacy. And I think that's important because we often imagine character being tested only in life's biggest moments. And if there's one thing I hope people, remember from this series is that becoming the value has never been about becoming more impressive. It's about becoming more trustworthy. It's about becoming the kind of person whose success strengthens everyone around them rather than simply elevating themselves. Awareness leads to intentionality. Intentionality produces consistency, and consistency is what forms character. The world promotes talent, life promotes character, and only one of them carry the weight of your legacy. So don't spend your lifetime simply trying to become more successful. Spend it becoming someone others can trust. Because when your character is stronger than your accomplishments, your influence will outlive both. If today's conversation encouraged or challenged you, I'd appreciate it if you'd like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your biggest takeaway or let me know what topic you'd like to explore next. Until next time, keep becoming.